or unless you're a Unitarian, where they give you everything but the Orthodox line. But they're selling something. I'm not selling anything. I'm trying to see everything from as many points of view as possible. If you look at Isaiah 7:14, what does it really say? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman, or that young woman, shall conceive, or is already pregnant, it's hard to know in the Hebrew, and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God in our midst. So, whoever this is, her son will represent God in our midst. Now, I've got to give you the background story of the Isaiah quote to make any sense of it. I know this is taking a long time, zipping right along, but we've got to do it in a complete way. What's happening here? There's a king on the throne of Israel, of Judah. Now remember, when Solomon died, Judah and Israel split in half. So now you have northern Israel in the north and Judah in the south, two little mini kingdoms. King Ahaz, the king of Judah, centered in Jerusalem, David's descendant, is a rather frightened king because two armies have surrounded Jerusalem. One, the army of northern Israel. They're Jewish brothers, but they're fighting with each other the way brothers do. And Syria. Syria and northern Israel have allied themselves against Judea or Judah, have come down, surrounded Jerusalem, and threatened King Ahaz unless he resigns his office and puts his cousin Ben-Tabil on the throne, and he would do the bidding of Syria and northern Israel, then they will destroy Jerusalem. They're surrounding Jerusalem right now. So poor King Ahaz is terrified. Two armies surround his city, and they're going to starve him out. He doesn't want to resign. So he goes out to inspect the waterworks to see if there's enough water in the reservoir to have his people survive. It's not like Flint, Michigan. There actually is a ruler here who wants his people to have good water. It takes the 21st century to find a governor who doesn't give it there. Unbelievable. In any case, he's out there looking at the reservoir. Isaiah, the prophet of that time, who believes the king should trust in God and not give in to these two invading armies. Isaiah meets him at the reservoir. And he says, King Ahaz, don't worry. I see you're terrified. Don't be terrified. These armies aren't going to come into Jerusalem because God has said that nobody can ever conquer Jerusalem. It's the city of the Temple of Solomon, God's home. They believed he literally lived in there. And therefore, the city of God's temple can't be destroyed. So just relax. And Ahaz is terrified. He's shaking. When they read this text in the synagogue, the reader of the Hebrew chant goes, ah. It says he swayed in the wind like a tree. And the Hebrew chant is wonderful. It expresses in the notes exactly the fear of the king. And the king says, well, I don't know. There are two armies here. What'll I do? And Isaiah says, don't worry. Ask for a sign from God. And Ahaz is so nervous and lacking in faith, he won't ask for a sign. So then the prophet says, all right, you coward, the Lord himself will give you a sign. That woman is pregnant, and she'll bear a son, and his name will be God is in our midst. That the birth of that son will represent God sticking with you. Well, why? Who is this woman? If she's the charwoman, it wouldn't mean anything, but she isn't. You have to look at chapter 9 for the birth announcement of the child announced in chapter 7, verse 14. You all know the verse, but you don't know it in context. Chapter 9, verse 6. This is a birth announcement that Isaiah is issuing from the royal palace. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. In the past, has been born, has been given. And the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called a Wonderful Counselor is the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father. This boy will be a Prince of Peace, a peaceful prince. His reign will be peaceful. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it, to uphold it with justice and righteousness. That means, to most scholars' way of reading, that the child that Isaiah was promising the king was his own child. That woman, that young woman who's pregnant, is the king's wife. And she's about to give birth to Hezekiah. And as weak a king as Ahaz was, Hezekiah was one of the two greatest kings of Judah. The Bible's authors give 100% grades to only two of those kings. This one, Hezekiah, who reformed the whole religion, and then Josiah, who came a few generations later, also a big reformer king. They were great kings. So what we have here is Isaiah telling the king, your wife is pregnant, she'll have a son. That means your dynasty will continue. Don't worry about resigning. And then he says, these two armies besieging your capital of Jerusalem will be swept away within a certain number of years. And they were. Northern Israel fell, and Syria fell to the Assyrian armies, just as Isaiah predicted. And Judah remained, not forever, but till 586 BC, long after this, a few hundred years. So, this is a messianic prophecy only if every king of Israel, and according to the initial meaning this is true, was a Messiah. A new anointed king will be born. He'll be a great king, unlike you. And Hezekiah was there for decades, and his rule was peaceful and wonderful. Everyone prospered. And it has nothing to do, however, with the classical notion of a perfected Messiah coming in hundreds of years. What Mathew has done, and what Handel does in his Messiah oratorio, is to take this out of the immediate context and apply it not to the king who's about to take Ahaz's place, but rather to a distant future Messiah, which the church sees as Jesus. And what else has been changed? Behold, a virgin shall conceive. It doesn't say virgin. The word virgin in Hebrew is betula. It says an alma will conceive. An alma is a young girl, not necessarily a virgin, unless you think every young girl's a virgin. Well, so if the prophet Isaiah wanted to say virgin, he would have said it. He didn't. He said that young woman is pregnant. But what happened? And how and why it happened, I don't know. Around 300 BC, when the Jews were ruled by the Ptolemies. Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BC, remember his last words? His generals were around his deathbed. To whom do you leave your empire, your majesty? I leave it to the strongest. And that led to a civil war. Ptolemy initially won it after 20 years, and Judea became part of Ptolemy's empire, which he ruled from Alexandria, a city he named in Egypt. He named after his master Alexander the Great. Most famous of the Ptolemy rulers was Cleopatra. She wasn't Egyptian, she was Greek. Ptolemy was a Greek general who took over Egypt and also annexed Jerusalem. Well, while Ptolemy ruled the Jews from 300 to 200 BC, the upper class of the Jews began to speak Greek, to be very Hellenized. That was the universal language of the day. And one of the things they did was to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And it became a world document for the first time. Every people could read it other than Jews. Very important. The first of the many great translations of the Bible. When it was translated, the Jewish translators translated the word Alma as virgin. I don't know why. So it's not something Christianity just imposed. Matthew is a Jew, but he's dealing with the Greek New Testament. It's entirely possible he wasn't fluent in Hebrew. They spoke, the Jews in those days, the lower class Jews spoke Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic. The upper class Jews spoke Greek. They prayed in Hebrew. Well, we Jews pray in Hebrew today. You go to the synagogue and the service is, well, at KKBE down the street on Hazel Street, it's about half Hebrew. You go to Emmanuel in West Ashley, it's all Hebrew, every word. And people know enough to get through that service. But if you give the average Charleston Jew a Hebrew text or a Hebrew newspaper from Israel today, you won't be able to read it. Jews today, and most Jews, are not fluent in Hebrew any more than they were in those days. They were when they all spoke Hebrew, which was a time of Moses, which was a very early Hebrew. But by Jesus' time, they were speaking Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew, and the literature was in Greek. And that's what Mathew, a learned Jew, probably, he may have been, well, I don't know, a rabbi, we don't know, but he's a scholar. He knows his Old Testament, but he knows it in Greek. So he is the first to give us the virgin birth. If you need the Bible back, take it. The virgin birth story based upon a Greek translation of the Old Testament. I won't say a mistranslation, that would be tendentious. I'm just saying a translation which doesn't say exactly what Matthew said. And why they changed it, it's hard to know, except that sometimes as history goes on, religion becomes more liberal, less peopled with angelic and demonic beings, and more rational. But sometimes it becomes more and more fantastic in terms of the early Jews didn't believe in angels and demons, but then they came to. In Satan, but then they came to. And so it may be that by the time of 300 BC, Jews for some reason expected the Messiah to be born of a virgin. In any case, they write that into the translation. But did they understand, by 300 BC, did they understand this passage, in which Isaiah is referring to the son of Ahaz, King Hezekiah, who's going to be born any moment? Did they understand it to be a classical messianic prophecy of a Messiah to come in the future? That's one change. And second, that were born of a virgin. Maybe they did. We don't know. The Ptolemaic period is very undocumented, except for the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. But why they chose that translation, one doesn't know. So for those Jews who read the Greek New Testament, Old Testament, rather than the Hebrew original, they may have expected the Messiah to be born of a virgin. When the change took place, I wish I knew. All right, so he's quoting, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and name him Emmanuel." And he believes that this is a fulfillment of that. When Joseph awoke, verse 24, from sleep, because all this had been told him in a dream, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife. He knew she wasn't a bad girl, it was the work of God. But had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son. That would suggest that afterwards they had a normal physical relationship. The Roman Catholic Church denies that and insists that Mary is forever virgin. Well, that's another Greek idea. The idea that virginity is innately better morally than a person who has an active sex life. Or in a moderate active sex life. The idea is it somehow is unclean. And Mary, if she is to be the Theotokos, the bearer of God, has got to be absolutely pure forever, according to Catholic doctrine. Protestants say no, she was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus, but then later on she had...
That's early church. That's
Right. And why is it? Well, it's Greek. Because the Jews never said the body was evil. It's the will that's evil. The human will gets us into trouble. Egocentricity gets us into trouble. Human arrogance gets us into trouble. But the body can't be evil, say the Jews, because God created the body as well as the soul. And God is good, and the good tree cannot bear evil fruit. So the Jews never identified the body as evil. The Greeks did. Not all the Greeks. The Greeks were also having the wonderful Olympics and building up the body and all of that stuff. But Socrates said, this is Greek philosophy, that the true philosopher studies only dying and death, meaning getting out of your body as soon as possible. The body is the prison house of the soul. The soul is the intellect, the part of our mind that can conceive of the infinite and the eternal. Therefore, it too must be infinite and eternal, say the Greeks. Like knows like. Aristotle believed when the eye perceived a color red, the eye in some sense became red. If I can conceive of God, the infinite and the eternal, then there's something infinite and eternal in me. That is my active intellect, as Aristotle called it, or my soul. Now a lot of Christians have a notion that we have a body, we have a brain, a mind, and we have a soul. It's a third thing. That's not what the Greeks meant. They identified it with the active intellect. So, if the intellect is good, and the body limits it, see, with my intellect, I can be here. Give me a minute. I'm now in Palm Beach. Now I'm in New York. I'm in all these places, but my body is stuck right here at this longitude and latitude. So the spirit, the mind is eternal and infinite and can span the universe. And so that's what the Greeks wanted. They asked Socrates, well, once you're dead, how should we bury you? It doesn't matter. Do what you want with me. That's not me. I will be up in the heavens speaking to the gods and the souls of other philosophers, talking philosophy forever, which is also my idea of heaven. So that was Socrates speaking, and that he set the tone. He was the first and greatest philosopher of any of us. And to get rid of the body is the main thing. And the Jews, the upper class Jews, intellectuals of the Hellenist school, they thought the same thing. So the body became somehow bad during the Hellenistic period, but they got over that. Judaism then went back to an idea that it's not the body and never was the body that gets us into trouble. But you read Philo, who's a great Alexandrian Jewish philosopher and theologian who was a Platonist. For him, it's the body. That's the bad thing. But not for mainstream Judaism. But here, it's very important for the Christian religion, which is that part of it that just stress, very big stress on Greek thought, that Mary be forever virgin, be sort of detached from her own body. But that's not clearly what's meant here. It said they didn't have sex until, and then apparently it suggests then they did. But certain churches read it differently. And they named him Jesus. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the time of King Herod, and he was the wicked king at the time, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, who was Herod? Herod was an Edomite whose father had converted to Judaism in order to create a new dynasty of Jewish kings. Most of the people didn't think he was really Jewish. They couldn't stand him. He was an opportunist. He was, I'm thinking of a particular loudmouth candidate today. Not that different. Just an opportunist and a big mouth. And a tyrant who was a flunky of the Romans, hated by the people. That's why he rebuilt Solomon's temple, to get on their good side. And he did produce one of the great, magnificent buildings of the ancient world, but people still detested him. He wasn't of the line of David. He had no right to be king, etc., etc. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, now it makes just a passing reference to that. Now Luke gives us a whole explanation of how the Holy Family got to Bethlehem. An explanation that is not at all convincing. It says that Caesar Augustus declared that all the world should be taxed. That's nowhere in Roman records. Nowhere. A world taxation would certainly be, they kept very good records. And everybody was supposed to go back to the town of their birth in order to enroll for their taxes. That's ridiculous. They're supposed to drop their careers and go on a donkey or a horse the long journey back to where they were born? That makes no sense. Why wouldn't they just pay the taxes where they were? But the story in Luke has to explain. He's a historian. Matthew doesn't explain, just says he was born in Bethlehem. Why? Because that's what the book of Micah predicted, so he had to be born in Bethlehem. But in Luke it explains how these people living far in the north in Nazareth ended up in Bethlehem. Frankly, I don't buy it. But you see, the idea is more important than the facts. Jesus is still the Savior, whether he was born in Bethlehem or in Tuscaloosa. What difference does it make? But to them, those things were extremely important. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Wise men. Now, they're not Jews. That's the important thing with them. Wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews?" Messiah reference again. King equals Messiah, equals Son of God, adopted Son of God. But here, Matthew makes it literal. In Mark, Jesus is the adopted Son of God. We know nothing of a virgin birth. We know nothing of a Holy Spirit impregnating his mother. We are introduced to him when John the Baptist pours water on his head, and you hear a voice saying, "This is my son." That's a quote from the second psalm, which was the coronation psalm, which the choir sang when they anointed the new king of Israel with oil. And so the heavens sing that when Jesus is anointed. So we'll get to the reason for the baptism in a minute. He's being anointed king. This book is essentially aimed at Jews, but it's also true that Matthew seems to realize, maybe unconsciously, that the future of the church is going to be more with Gentiles than Jews. He wants as many Jews as possible to get on board, and all the early church were Jewish. But it was clear by the end of the first century, we're dealing with a book written about 85, 90 AD, that more and more Gentiles were coming in. The great center of the church was in Antioch in Syria, not in Jerusalem. There was a Jerusalem church run by James, Jesus' brother, but Antioch was a lot bigger, and those people were Gentiles. So Matthew gives us a story which curiously isn't in Luke, the Gentile Christian gospel, that 3 Gentile, not Jewish wise men, came to Jerusalem and were the first to recognize Jesus before any of the Jews. In Luke, who was the first to recognize Jesus? The shepherds, and they're Jewish. So you have that Jewish business in the Gentile gospel, and this Gentile business in the Jewish gospel. It's very curious. And in the beginning, the Gentile wise men are the first to look at this baby and see divinity. That's insight. The sight the Bible is interested in is insight. You need insight of faith to see that. Otherwise, Jesus just looks like a baby. And then at the end of the book, what do you have? You have the risen Christ at the end of Matthew saying, "Lech l'kol goyim," go to all nations, to Gentiles, and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So it begins with Gentiles and it ends with Gentiles. And in between, you have the struggle to win over the Jews, which is not entirely successful. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, it doesn't explain how he got there. He's from Nazareth, but that's where they go. Wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Well, where would a king be born? They saw a star. And apparently the star is moving. Was it a comet? What was it? We don't know. And they go to Jerusalem. That's where kings of the Jews are born. Asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising." Now, I think it's translated this way to avoid the problem. We observed his star in the east. They didn't observe his star in the east. What they mean is we who were in the east observed his star, which is moving west. So the rising is apparently in the east, but they're moving west. We observed his star at its rising and have followed it and have come to pay him homage. When King Herod, the false king, the wicked king, remember the book of Exodus is a fight between the false god, Pharaoh, and the true God of Israel. Here you have a fight between a false king and a true king. And Jesus is the true king. And Herod is a homicidal maniac. He killed his wife, he killed his children. He was a lunatic. When King Herod heard this, it's a comment on politics. That's what you'll find in political leadership. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened. Of course he was. The true king has come. And all Jerusalem with him. Because most people said Herod had no right to be king anyway. He's not even really Jewish. He certainly isn't of the descent of David. And he's imposed on us by the Roman tyrants, and we hate him. And now a possible new king being born. Oh, got to get rid of him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, meaning his flunkies, whoever they were, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Do they have any prophecies? They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And this is an accurate quote. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, among the towns of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to be the shepherd of my people. Shepherd, meaning Messiah. And this is a fulfillment of Micah the prophet, chapter 5, verse 2. He does predict a Davidic Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. He has to be, because that's where David was born. So we've now seen the term Messiah 6 times. In verse 4, the 6th mention of Messiah. You think he's trying to pound on us a meaning? So Herod now knows where the kid's going to be born. Be careful. These wise men are innocent, lovely people. They don't know Herod's a monster. Then Herod secretly, verse 7, called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. See, the true king has to be born in Bethlehem. And that's, of course, in the prophecy. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage. No, he means go to kill him. No room for 2 kings in this country. When they had heard the king, they set out in all innocence. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising. I'm not trying to interpret what this star means. It's a magical kind of thing, and you either accept it or you don't. Until it's, they a comet, this and that, and they read the charts of that time to figure it out. I don't know. And it stopped over the place where the child was. Is it a manger? No, there's no manger here. It's a house. Luke has the manger. Matthew says a house. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. And on entering the house, there's no stable. None of them mentions a stable. When Luke says a manger, he means out in the open field where cows drink from it. We invent a stable in our medieval art just to dress it up. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And there's nothing more lovely than seeing a children's Christmas pageant with the kids dressed up as the 3 kings, and they bring their little gifts. At St. Thomas's in New York, boy, do they do that beautifully. We 3 kings of audience. All right. Gold I bring, blah, 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 blah. Now, why gold? Gold for a king. Why frankincense? Incense for a god. Now that comes from Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6. It says, and it's about Israel, not about the Messiah. When Israel is glorified, foreign rulers will bring gold and frankincense to honor the God of Israel. And everybody will recognize, the big theme in Isaiah, everyone will recognize the authority of the God of Israel as the God of the universe. Gold and frankincense. So Matthew picks it right up from there, takes it out of context. And of course, Israel is the messianic collective people in the Old Testament. Jesus is the individual Messiah in the New, so he just applies it to Jesus. And he adds something, myrrh. Apparently a substance used to anoint dead bodies for preservation. Now, historically, it makes no sense whatsoever to bring myrrh to a newborn baby. If the baby is God, then frankincense makes sense. If he's a king, gold makes sense. But myrrh, they're not going to use that myrrh for 30 years until Jesus dies. But mythically, it makes sense. In a myth, there is no time. It doesn't exist. So you have, who is Jesus? He's God. He is a king. He's a divine king who must die. The divine king who must die. Gold, frankincense, myrrh. It's brilliant. It's all symbolic stuff. And it's verses taken out, not at random, but out of context in the Old Testament to create this magnificent story, which is a sense, all these prophecies and verses put together into a new story. and presented as the fulfillment. So they bring him gold and frankincense and myrrh, which tells the reader who he is. Everybody in those days knew frankincense means for a divinity, and gold for a king, and myrrh for the dead. And having been warned in a dream, again a dream number 2, not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. So there now you have another fulfillment of Isaiah 60, verse 6. So 3 fulfillments so far. Fulfillment, fulfillment, fulfillment. Now, well, I came late. I'll give you another 5 minutes, if you don't mind. Chapter 2, verses 13 through 23, the flight into Egypt. After they had left, the wise men, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream number 3, and said, "Get up, Kumi, arise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt." Do you think that's a mistake? Why don't they go to Syria? Or what is now Transjordan, that's closer. No, they go to Egypt. They have to go to Egypt because of the parallel with Moses. Moses brings the people, Israel, out of Egypt. Jesus will now come out of Egypt. Moses leads them across water, the Red Sea. Jesus crosses the water of the baptism. He is immersed in water. Moses leads them in 40 years in the wilderness wandering. Jesus, after the baptism, his passage through water, goes into the desert for 40 days. Israel succumbs to satanic influences by building the golden calf. Jesus rejects Satan 3 times. So he's improving on Israel now. Then Moses goes up to a mountain, Mount Sinai. Jesus goes up to the Mount of the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. And then Moses leads us into the promised land. Jesus leads us into heaven. 5-point exact parallel. He's got to reproduce the history of Moses the way he reproduces in his life the history of ancient Israel. That's the richness and the genius of the text. Now after they had, and just imagine yourself a Jewish Christian, not sure, did I do the right thing by joining this church? Or maybe I haven't joined yet, maybe I should, I don't know what to do. Let me read this book by this guy called Mathew, and say, my God, look at it. It's point by point by point by point. Jesus equals Moses, and equals Israel. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and to flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph arose, took the child and his mother by night, and fled into Egypt. Again repeats the story of Israel, going from Palestine into Egypt. And they remained there until the death of Herod. Now Herod, of course, is the new Pharaoh.